All right, welcome back to the listener's commentary on the Gospel of John. In this recording, we're going to be looking at John 13, verses 1 through 32. And before we jump into the material, as well as the context for the setting in the Gospel of John, just a little bit of note. Beginning in chapter 13 and going all the way through chapter 16, we have what's often called the Upper Room Discourse. And there is a ton of scholarly debate about how to harmonize the meal at which that discourse happens with the Passover meal in the Synoptics. And I understand the reasons for that debate. I just happen to think sometimes those reasons are far overstated. And so I'm going to include in the study hub a document from Gary Burge's commentary on the Gospel of John that I think does a really helpful job summarizing the debate, giving the options, and helping us see that maybe it's not as complicated as scholars have made it out to be. And so with all of that as sort of a preface, I think beginning here in chapter 13, we're going to be looking at Passover night with Jesus and his disciples. So John chapter 13 opens part 2 of the Gospel of John. Part 1 concluded at the end of chapter 12, and it did so by showing us that Jesus is the true light. He's shining brightly in the world, and yet, even though that's the case, many are still walking in darkness and want to extinguish the light. Jesus ends that part by calling people to believe in him and thus believe in the light. And so chapters 1 through 12, that's part 1. And it focused on the signs that Jesus had performed that pointed to who Jesus is, and as far as John is concerned, ought to lead people to believing in him. Beginning in this recording, we pick up in part 2, which involves chapters 13 through 21, and those chapters focus on Jesus's hour. Recall, as we walked through part 1 in chapters 1 through 12, Jesus kept saying his hour hadn't come. His hour hadn't come. He managed to escape them because his hour hadn't come. Well, now beginning in chapter 13, his hour has come. The culmination of his ministry and the culmination of his purpose in coming to the earth. And for much of chapters 13 through 21, Jesus is going to be alone with his closest followers. So, for example, chapters 13 through 16, the Upper Room Discourse that I mentioned, he's with his disciples on the night before his crucifixion, celebrating Passover. Chapter 17, he's still with them, and he offers a prayer for them in that same context. Chapters 18 and 19, you get his arrest, trial, and crucifixion. And then in chapters 20 and 21, you get his resurrection appearances once again to his disciples and close followers. And so much of this all revolves around the events leading immediately up to his arrest, trial, and crucifixion, and then leading out of that with his resurrection. And so we pick up in John chapter 13, verse 1, and it reads like this. Now, before the feast of Passover, Jesus, knowing that his hour had come, that he would depart from this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. Couple things to note. We've already been told earlier on in John's gospel that Passover was near, John 11:25. We've also been told that Jesus arrived back in Jerusalem 6 days before Passover. Now, here in 13:1, John adds one additional note about Jesus' mindset as he heads into this Passover feast. And that note is this: Jesus knows that this is it. He knows his hour has come. He knows he's leaving this world and about to return to the Father. And so John tells us here in verse 1, with that mindset, he's prepared to love his own all the way to the end. What does he mean by the end? Well, it probably means the end goal, like the purpose of his coming, all the way to death, all the way for the reason he came, laying down his life for them. Now, verse 1 is then the header for everything that follows here in part 2. And so everything that follows is going to show Jesus loving his own to the end, to the utmost, to the whole end point of his ministry. So on that note, John begins to describe what happens at the Passover supper on what we would call Thursday evening. For them, it was the beginning of Friday because their days started at 6 in the evening. So what we would call Thursday evening, what for them was the beginning of Friday. Here's what happens during that Passover, beginning in John 13, verse 2. And during the supper, that is the Passover supper, the devil, having already put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon, to betray him. Notice how Judas is described. He is a pawn of the devil, and there's already a plan in motion that has been inspired, John tells us, by the devil through Judas. And we need to pay attention to this because John brings it up several times in this snapshot here in chapter 13, which suggests that for John, this fact of Judas, the betrayer, and even the devil's role in his betrayal is an important part of the drama of this scene. So, Judas, having already determined to betray him, verse 3, Jesus, knowing that the Father had handed over all things to him, and that he had come forth from God and was going back to God, Jesus got up from the supper, laid his outer garments aside, took up a towel, and tied it around his waist. Now, notice what John tells us. Jesus knows fully who he is. He knows that the Father has handed over everything to him, the whole universe to him. All of God's kingdom has been handed over to Jesus. He knows that. He knows that he's come from God and that he's about ready to return to God. He knows this. He's fully aware of who he is. So, knowing all of this, John tells us he does something surprising. In fact, if you pause for a second and think about it, it's actually contrary to how we would expect somebody who knows all of that to act. Jesus takes up the role of a servant. He takes off his outer garments, he puts a towel around his waist, and he prepares to wash the disciples' feet. So look at verse 5 and what Jesus does. Then he poured water into a basin, into a large bowl, and he began washing the disciples' feet and wiping them with the towel which he had tied around himself. This is actually a lowly act of service. It was the kind of task that was reserved for a household servant, usually a junior household servant, and it was something that he would do for the guests. As people had traveled from wherever they had come, their feet were covered in dirt and whatever else they had stepped in, and they needed to be cleaned. And Jesus now takes up that role, and he begins to wash their feet. And as I noted above, this is surprising, and the reason for that is it's definitely not how you would expect someone of superior rank to act. This isn't how someone of superior rank treated those under him in Jesus' world and throughout the world, largely throughout history. But Jesus, knowing full well who he is, God's king, the ruler of the universe, he kneels down and he washes the disciples' feet. And as he's washing their feet, he comes to Peter, verse 6. And so he came to Simon Peter. He said to him, "Lord, are you washing my feet?" Peter's incredulous. They're like, no way, you're not going to wash my feet. And Jesus answered and said to him, "What I am doing, you do not realize right now, but you will understand later." In other words, this will all make more sense later, Peter. Just trust me. One of these days, you'll understand what it fully means to follow me and what that entails of you. So just trust me and let me wash your feet. But Peter said to him, verse 8, "Never shall you wash my feet." And Jesus answered him, "If I don't wash you, you have no place with me. If you don't allow me to do this act and any other sort of cleansing that I need to do of you, you have no part of my kingdom, my people. You're not one of my disciples." Well, Simon Peter said to him in verse 9, "Lord, then wash not only my feet, but my hands and my head." In other words, Peter is so devoted to Jesus and so much wants to be a part of what Jesus offers that he's like, if washing is necessary to be a part of you, Jesus, then wash a whole lot more than my feet. Jesus said to him, "He who is bathed needs only to have his feet washed, otherwise he's completely clean. If you've already had a bath, I don't need to wash your hands, your head, your whole body, or anything else. I just need to clean your feet." And then Jesus says, "And you are clean, but not all of you." And John explains what he means by that in verse 11. For he knew the one who was betraying him. It was for this reason that he said, "Not all of you are clean." Once again, we get the presence of Judas, the betrayer, around the table, having his feet washed. Even Judas's feet get washed by Jesus, even though Jesus knows he's not really clean. And then verse 12 continues the scene by saying, then when he had washed their feet, so when he had finished the job and taken his garments, that is his outer robe, his outer garments, and reclined at the table again, he said to them, do you know what I've done for you? You call me teacher, rabbi, and Lord, and you're correct, for so I am. Again, Jesus knows who he is. He knows he's the Messiah. He knows God's kingdom is being handed over to him. He knows all that. So you're correct in saying all that. And then he explains in verse 14, so if I, the Lord and the teacher, washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet, for I gave you an example so that you would also do just as I did for you. Jesus washed their feet as an act of humble love, of self-lowering service to them. And now he says to them, and by extension to us, follow my example. Follow my example of humble service, whether that entails washing someone's feet or other deeds of lowly, humble service that care for other people. That's what he did as teacher and Lord. And that's what he expects his followers to do. So you should follow my example. And then he goes on and says, truly, truly, I say to you, a slave is not greater than his master, nor is one who is sent greater than the one who sent him. In other words, if Jesus, our master, our Lord and teacher, if he did this, then that's what we do. That's what disciples do. If the one who is sending us in the world as his emissaries, as his representatives did this, well, then we should do the same sort of thing. We should love and serve the people around us. Jesus then says, if you know these things, you're blessed if you do them. And when he says you're blessed if you do them, it's not as if there's some sort of arbitrary blessing attached to this act. No, what he's saying is practicing this kind of lowly, humble service so fits how we're actually made to operate that there's a blessedness when we live this way. Then Jesus explains in verse 18, I'm not speaking about all of you. I know the ones whom I have chosen, but this is happening so that the scripture may be fulfilled. He who eats my bread has lifted up his heel against me. Notice once again, we get the betrayer, a reference to Judas, an allusion to him. And Jesus is saying, here we are, gather around this table, and I've washed all your feet. And yet, I know there's somebody here who's going to eat this meal with me, eats my bread, and yet he's lifted up his heel against me. He's intending to do me harm. And he actually quotes a passage from Psalm 41, verse 9. Let me read a little bit of that context out of that psalm just so you can hear it, so you can kind of get a sense of what Jesus is feeling and thinking. Psalm 41, I want to pick up in verse 5, and we'll read down through verse 9, which is what Jesus quotes. It says this, my enemies speak evil against me. When will he die and his name perish? And when he comes to see me, he speaks empty words. His heart gathers wickedness to itself. When he goes outside, he tells it. All who hate me whisper together against me. They plot my harm against me, saying, a wicked thing is poured out upon him, so that when he lies down, he will not get up again. Even my close friend, in whom I trusted, who ate my bread, has lifted up his heel against me. It's that context. Jesus knows what's going on, and he knows that Judas is in league with his enemies. And so Jesus says that this psalm is going to be filled up in what Judas is about to do. That while it was true perhaps of David in one sense, it's true in a deeper and even greater sense of Jesus, who is the true son of David. And so this scripture is going to be filled up in a deeper way in Jesus through what Judas is about to do. And then Jesus continues and says in verse 19, from now on, I'm telling you before it happens, so that when it does happen, you may believe that I am he. In other words, Jesus is making sure they know they need to pay attention. He says, I'm telling you some things that are going to happen in the next few hours and the next few days, and you need to pay attention so that when they happen, you will know that I am. I am who I've told you I am. I am the I am I've been telling you. Remember, we saw several times already in John's gospel, several I am statements about Jesus. I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. Even just the standalone I am to the authorities when he says, before Abraham was born, I am. And Jesus is saying, I want you to pay attention to what I'm about to tell you, what I'm telling you right now, so that when it happens, you'll believe even more fully and completely that everything I've said about myself, it's true. He goes on and says in verse 20, truly, truly, I say to you, the one who receives anyone I send receives me. And the one who receives me receives him who sent me. If you're sent by Jesus and you're commissioned by him and people welcome you, then they're also welcoming Jesus. If they welcome Jesus, that means they welcome God, that Jesus, God, and Jesus' followers are all in this together and they're all united in this and tied up. So to welcome one is to welcome the other. And when Jesus had said these things, he became troubled in spirit and testified and said, truly, truly, I say to you that one of you will betray me. And so once again, we see the presence of the betrayer. And now we actually see why John has highlighted the presence of the betrayer. It's weighing on Jesus. It's emotionally affecting him. He's become troubled, right? And he blurts this out. And he does so with grand feeling because it's deeply affecting him. And that, therefore, adds a profoundness and even a poignancy to this act of lowly, humble service of washing Judas's feet. Jesus knows what's coming. He knows it's coming through one of his closest companions, one who's eating with him that very night, and yet he still lowers himself and serves them and even serves the betrayer. Now, that comment from Jesus, with all the emotion in which it was stated, provokes curiosity from the disciples around the table. The disciples began to look at one another at a loss to know which one he was speaking about. Like, what? One of us betray you? No, who could it be? And then somewhere in this moment, Peter wants the scoop. He's curious and he wants to know, like, who is Jesus talking about? So here's what happens. Look at verse 23. Lying back on Jesus' chest was one of his disciples, whom Jesus loved. This is actually the first mention of this nickname, one whom Jesus loved, in the Gospel of John. And it refers to John himself. This is a nickname that John kind of uses to describe himself here in the Gospel. And so we see then that John is reclining right next to Jesus. Remember, when they're eating this meal, they're reclining at the table with lying on one side with one elbow on the table. So John's place at the table puts him where he can lean back right against Jesus' chest. So because John's in that position, here's what happens, verse 24. So Simon Peter nodded to this disciple. He gives him a little head nod to get his attention and then said to him, tell us who it is of whom he's speaking. And so Peter wants to know, gets John's attention and says, find out who he means. So, verse 25, he, that is the one Jesus loved, namely John himself, simply leaned back on Jesus' chest and said to him, Lord, who is it? And Jesus then answered and said, that man is the one for whom I shall dip the piece of bread and give it to him. What does this also tell us? Well, it also tells us that Judas is right next to Jesus, so close to Jesus that Jesus can hand him a piece of bread as a part of the meal when they're dipping in the various spices and sauces for the meal. And so Judas is actually right next to Jesus, which would suggest he's positioned also in a place of honor at this table. So when Jesus had dipped the piece of bread, he took it and gave it to Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot. And after this, Satan then entered him. John has already told us in verse 2 that the devil is the one who's using Jesus. Now he tells us that Satan enters him, that Satan, the adversary, the one who is the accuser, right? The adversary of God's people. Satan has entered Judas, and now things really begin to get tense. Therefore, Jesus said to Judas, what you are doing, do it quickly. And so Jesus knows. And in saying this, he intimates to Judas that, Judas, I know what you're up to. And he tells him to do it quickly. Now, the disciples are all gathered around a big U-shaped table, and they're all reclining, and there's a crowd, and it's noisy in the room. And so they hear at least some of what Jesus is saying, but they don't really get what all it's referring to. So look at verse 28. Now, none of those reclining at the table knew for what purpose he had said this to him. Like, what you're doing, do it quickly. They heard him say it. They're trying to figure out, wait a second, what are we talking about? Some were assuming, since Judas kept the money box, that Jesus was saying to him, buy some things we need for the feast. Wait a second, aren't they eating the feast? Well, you got to keep in mind, the way it all worked. They're eating Passover, but immediately after the Passover feast is the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which follows for 7 days. And so they're thinking, maybe we need some supplies for the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Or maybe some are thinking, well, maybe he was saying that as an act of piety, go give something to the poor as a way to express our love for the poor. So they don't really get what Jesus means. And they didn't hear the little interchange between Peter and John and Jesus about dipping the bread. So they don't really understand what's all going on and why he said this to Judas. But Judas, as a pawn of the devil, he has a plan and he's sticking with it. So look at verse 30. So after receiving the piece of bread, he, that is Judas, left immediately, and it was night. Notice that. John throws in that line, and it was night. Both literally and metaphorically. The theme of light and darkness has been a key part of John's gospel so far. We saw it in chapter 1, verse 4, that in Jesus was life, and that life was the light of mankind. We saw in verse 5 of chapter 1 that the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness doesn't get it. We saw John the Baptist is described as coming as a witness to the light. We saw in chapter 3 where Jesus says that this is the judgment that's come in the world. The light has come into the world, and people love the darkness rather than the light. Chapter 8, verse 12, Jesus spoke again to them saying, I am the light of the world. The one who follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. And chapter 9, we must carry out the works of him who sent me as long as it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world. Well, John tells us now, in this moment, when Judas leaves the Passover feast, it was night. Night has now come. Darkness will now prevail. But even in the midst of the darkness, the light will shine, and God will glorify Jesus, the Son of Man. Look at verse 31. Therefore, when he had left, that is when Judas had left, Jesus said, Now is the Son of Man glorified, and God is glorified in him. And if God is glorified in him, God will also glorify him in himself, and will glorify him immediately. In other words, light shines most brightly in the deepest, darkest night. And the hour of Jesus' death that he knew before this feast had arrived, well, it's come. It's also the hour of Jesus' glorification. In other words, this time of darkness, this time of night, well, it's also Jesus' crowning moment. It's when, contrary to all appearances, the light overcomes the darkness, and God is glorified in Jesus. That's the point of verse 31. And so as we wrap up this section, there's actually much for us to think about and reflect on, but let me offer just one. One thing to think about here is, how can we follow the example of washing feet, just like Jesus washed the disciples' feet? That's what he says. He gave us an example. And that's set in this context of like darkness as the backdrop. And here in this moment, as a picture of Jesus loving them to the end, he's washing the disciples' feet. How can we follow that example? Not only literally, if we're in a cultural context where it makes sense to wash feet, but the principle. And the principle is serving others, self-lowering service. How can we, in genuine love and care, empty ourselves to serve others? That's the principle. And that can happen in small ways, and that can happen in big ways. In fact, sometimes the ordinary little unseen small ways, like washing feet, is really what really matters in life. It could be the way we care for some elderly neighbors or elderly family members. It could be the way we care for children who need our attention and our care. It can be the way we serve maybe neighbors who can't take care of their own house or their own yard. How can we follow the example of Jesus of self-lowering service as a means to becoming more like that from the inside out, and as an expression of the imitation of Jesus? Jesus' whole ministry it follows this trajectory, this pattern of self-emptying, self-lowering. Here, in this simple act of foot washing, he shows us This is what I expect my disciples to be and to do. And so if we're going to be like Jesus, then let us lower ourselves to serve others just as he did so for them as well as for us. All right, thanks for tuning into this session of the Listener's Commentary on the New Testament. The Listener's Commentary is a listener-supported, crowd-funded Bible teaching ministry that's possible only because of the generosity of dozens of people just like you. So thanks a ton for your support. And if you have been encouraged, challenged, built up by the Listener's Commentary, could I just ask you to consider joining the team of supporters so that we could expand this ministry? We could add transcripts. We could even use some of the tools available to us now to offer translations of the commentary in other languages. All of that takes time, resources, and money. So would you prayerfully consider joining the team of supporters? The easiest way to do that is to go to listenerscommentary.com, click the Give button, and that'll redirect you to a page through World Family Mission, a registered nonprofit. And I've set up my giving portal through them, and you can put in a dollar amount, click a little box that says make this monthly if you want to make it a recurring monthly donation, and then those funds will be given to support this ministry. So let me say in advance, thanks a ton for your support.